and we'll be happy to chime in the answering of questions, I guess. Both of us work at an organization called the Qualitative Data Repository, which is, for those of you who may not have encountered us before, still a fairly new organization with the specific focus on preserving, assisting in the curation of, and sharing for the long run materials with a strong qualitative component, if not exclusively qualitative, from across the social sciences. And we define the social sciences fairly broadly to include things like education, public health, and so on. So a lot of research work that happens across universities that prior to QDR didn't have a very dedicated place that it could be shared. And in the course of our work, the organization, the public face of the repository has been online since 2014. And so in the course of our work over the past few years, we have discovered a variety of challenges, obviously, that accompany sharing social science qualitative data, which many times, in many the case of many projects, revolves around human participant data. And in many of those occasions, although not all, involves sensitive data, sort of by the virtue of the characteristics of social science work in the qualitative vein. So we've encountered a variety of challenges that you can probably, those of you who work with researchers on the data librarian, and can easily imagine. And in the course of that, we decided that we should do some more sort of research of our own, and we're doing several different things, of which this presentation is one aspect. And the bigger initiative we call Working with Sensitive Research Data Wizard Project. And we decided that we need to
Sorry to interrupt, Dessi. We're getting some notes that I think the view that you're sharing is not the presenter view right now. So if you could just take a minute and adjust your PowerPoint.
I'm sorry. I didn't know actually that the presenter view would work, but let's give it a try and you tell me what people are seeing. Is this better?
That's perfect, yes. Okay,
sorry. Yeah, so the various challenges that data librarians can easily imagine that I summarized about often involve not just the specifics of the data, but what kinds of commitments researchers had made during the course of their research. And those commitments were typically recorded in the informed consent scripts that were approved during their IRB process, which again, often in these types of projects, the IRB, the local institutional review boards, the ethics boards would be involved. And so the whole starting point of all of this is that, as I imagine the audience here, most of us know the various factors that shape data sharing possibilities, the enforcement coming from funders and publishers, the enabling factors coming from the wider availability of repositories such as ours, the technological tools that have been enabling people to collect vast amounts of data and to easily copy and reproduce them, which should help with data sharing. And then researchers obviously being the implementers under all these factors. But then IRBs are often seen, to the degree that people recognize their role in data sharing, IRBs are often have been seen traditionally as potential hurdles. And so we decided to kind of interrogate this a little bit further, do some empirical work with IRBs and figure out how they see their role, whether their practices have been changing, where they've been learning about data sharing from, and how, or whether first, but then how maybe what they're advising researchers to do, or what they're expecting researchers to do with respect to data sharing has been shifting, just like a lot of other research practices have been. So we both kind of started with this idea that there's a lot of pieces that interlock with each other. And so the resolution of these challenges that I talked about potentially should be also found in the collective and in the collaboration of all these different actors and types of actors within the research landscape. So this is what this kind of graphic here tries to represent, that whatever tensions there are between data sharing of particularly qualitative but sensitive data within the social sciences and the commitments to ethical treatment of human participants the solution to these tensions needs to reside in some sort of collaboration overlap amongst these various entities, with, as I said, the IRBs being kind of a critical piece that maybe for a while was missing from the conversations about data sharing that were happening otherwise in the information science and data science community. But they shouldn't be missing, right? The IRBs are really critical, whether those of us on the data side realize it or whether the IRB personnel themselves realized it at first, because the kinds of questions that are often asked within, or should be asked really within a data management plan when data sharing is considered, really concern the same kinds of things that an IRB would worry about. So how much do the data carry from a given project? Are there additional risks that come from sharing the data? Are there specific tools that might enable our researchers to minimize those risks of sharing? How likely are any of those risks? On the other side, are there benefits that would not accrue to the research if the data are not shared? How might those benefits be maximized? Because really the IRBs are not just about looking at the potential risks, they are about weighing the risks versus the benefits. And so the kinds of questions, as I said, that a researcher should be asking, possibly with the guidance of their data librarian, possibly with the guidance of a staff member at a data repository, really are the same kinds of questions that IRBs, if they know about it, would be asking upfront as well. But the critical piece is if they know about it, right? If the researcher knew from the beginning to include their description of what potentially the data sharing plan is within their IRB protocol. And what we've discovered, I'm going to skip this here. It's by way of illustration, those of you who are interested may see what researchers themselves say, and that they have started to recognize that tension between the two mandates. But what we've discovered is that oftentimes researchers might not be thinking about the data sharing aspect early enough in the project, that this idea or the need for data sharing comes to them later in the project, because that's typically when they encounter one of the enforcement drivers, namely journal publications, for example, where the journal expects them to share the data. And so that's when they would arrive to a data repository and say, okay, I'm now ready and planning to share my data. And we at the repository and will see the kind of informed consent that they used 2 or 3 or 5 years before that say the kinds of things that make data sharing completely impossible. And so that's, those kinds of common occurrences made us realize that we need to do some kind of work that both understands what the role of the IRBs is, but also brings them into the conversation so that they are aware that the kinds of commitments they approve for researchers up front have very direct implications on the data sharing possibility at the end. And again, none of this is probably too novel for those of you who also work with researchers, but I think what would be novel in the rest of our presentation is to hear from us, from our empirical work with talking to IRB professionals, what they think about these issues, what they think about this presumed tension, and how they might be part of the solution as well. Before we actually got to talking to IRBs, we did one quick preliminary study in 2017, which really concerned just looking at the public guidance that a variety of IRBs present on their websites to their researchers. So we just downloaded the guidance and read through it to understand whether we really thought what kind of advice do they give with respect to data sharing. Now it's more of a question of whether at all they talk about data sharing. And at least 3 years ago, there was only very, very minimal recognition of that practice, which has become so important to researchers. But looking at the IRB guidance, you would not know it. Literally, of the 114 guidance documents that we analyzed, 3 documents mentioned sharing, 4 documents mentioned archive, and 5 documents shared repository. So altogether, that amounted to 0.1% of all the documents referencing any aspect of data sharing. So obviously very discouraging from the perspective of an institution that tries to promote appropriate and ethical data sharing. But then we continued, we saw that things are changing. So even the documents that we had reviewed have been replaced in many cases in the subsequent 2 or 3 years. And so we saw that something's happening on their end as well. And so last year we decided to proceed with a different kind of empirical study where we actually did individual interviews with professionals from 17 R1 universities across the country. And then we did 12 more in 2 regional focus groups. And the goal, looking at these specific schools that are obviously not representatives of all the schools across the country, but the goal was to see the places that received the most SPE funding from the NSF have to say about this prospect, because they, in reality, they often have been to be trendsetter for others, for other institutions that may be less well resourced. And also their researchers are most directly under those dual mandates of data sharing expectation on the part of the funders, and then obviously the federal regulations for human participant research, that's the same across, but the funder requirement presumably would affect more of the community of those types of institutions. And so some of the summary of
your 5 minutes remaining.
Okay, is that IRBs first learn about the data sharing component or challenges from researcher protocols, and to some degree we expected that, but we discovered that that's really probably the most limited way that an IRB can then inform itself about what it needs to do in order to promote data sharing. There was never any kind of external guidance mentioned and as an initiating driver to learn more about data sharing needs of the researcher community. Less expected place from which IRBs learn about sharing, and again, there was fewer institutions mentioned that, but it was still interesting that sometimes researchers turn to them with data use agreements when they want to obtain secondary data. So the researchers were not collectors of primary data, but users of shared data, which came with certain conditions. And then they turn to their IRB to ask, could you give me approval could you give me guidance how I can gain approval to use these data. And then similarly, PIs sometimes need to cooperate internally. So this is a more limited sense of data sharing. It's not data sharing to the wider public or even the wider scholarly community, but nonetheless, it still necessitates detailed plans for how to do this appropriately. And then in both of those cases, what IRB professionals told us that they kind of developed solutions on an ad hoc basis. This is where the IRB community currently stands. Many of them, especially at our institutions, have now been made aware that this is an ongoing tension, that it's something that needs more input and more guidance and more help from the IRB side as well as the data professional side, but the solutions that they've come up with typically so far have been on a kind of project and case-by-case basis. They're responding to what individual researchers ask them. Nonetheless, everybody that we spoke with said, even though this is what we've been doing, we wish there was some kind of centralized source of more information, more standardized form, more standardized informed consent language that could be suggested to us, that then we in turn could suggest to PIs. And I will give a little bit of a link to something that we try to develop on the QGR end. I'm going to skip the thing on the common role. If somebody has a question about it at the end, I can talk about it. Basically, there was a big revision of the main federal regulations concerning human participant research. To the degree that it concerned data sharing, its effect was very tangential. It made people maybe a little bit more aware of the need to talk about their data sharing plans, but it didn't give any answers by any means. Then the most common reactions that we saw, and that I think is interesting, IRBs have started to change their forms, and as a result also some of the guidance that accompanies those forms. They have added new questions that specifically and directly reference data sharing, and that immediately alerts researchers to the need to talk about this already in the very early planning stages of their proposals, and not only realize that they need to do data sharing at the end. Less common reactions have been what we call the proactive IRBing. Basically, IRB professionals realizing that they need to go out of their way and educate themselves to these funder requirements, that the faculty on their campus will need to comply with. Also, some IRBs, and that to us was a very promising sign, have started actively discouraging PIs from saying things that, our team or I will be the only person who will ever see the data, which they continue seeing this kind of language, but they've started discouraging PIs from saying it. And then even in the cases where there's no data sharing mentioned at all, actually asking and inquiring about it. Now, I would not say that that's every IRB out there. It really is not. It's less common, but it is an encouraging sign of a shift of mindset. And the most encouraging sign was this kind of very rare example, but nonetheless one that exists. And I thought data librarians might want to know that IRB counterparts, some of them anyway, have gotten to the point where they actually have started thinking about data sharing as a benefit, not only as a liability, not only as a risk, which is the assumption. That here's somebody who said in submissions, people will say, this might lead to increased knowledge about topic X. And we, the IRB, take that on faith. But if that data never gets out in the scientific community, is never shared, that benefit can't be realized. When we heard that, we were, as I said, truly encouraged. And so I'm now quoting the IRB person to all of their colleagues when we go and do presentations to the IRB world. But also I wanted data librarians to know about this as well. And so what could data librarians do to, oops, somehow I can't proceed with my slides. Okay, what kind of lessons can data librarians take from this kind of work that we're doing? So obviously, and this is something that in some form actually was mentioned in the prior two presentations, there is this need and move towards more holistic data management. And that doesn't mean just across the life of a research project, but also across different types of actors that PIs interact with across that research project. So within any one campus, the need for intra-campus coordination is clearly there. And in some cases, it's better realized than in others. So the issues are complex and the solutions do require expertise from the library side, from the research data services side, from IT services, and from the IRB. So those organizations truly need to be talking to each other. And there's been a lot of reorganization in the past decade or so in some universities to accomplish this better. So any one of you, any one data librarian out there who might be listening should try to figure out what the current landscape looks on your campus. Does this kind of collaboration exist? Is there a kind of group, and I gave it one example of a name that oftentimes was mentioned, something like a research data stewards group. Is there such a group that exists? Could, is your research data services office represented well? Is it represented at all? And if it's not, could you be the person who joins and tries to contribute that perspective? If you're on the kind of campus where that kind of collaboration has not been advanced greatly, maybe reach out personally to colleagues at these offices. But again, our focus is primarily at the IRB. So reach out to colleagues at the IRB that you may or may not have talked about before, that you may or may not have thought you need to be talking about. Drop a list of relevant resources that you would give to PIs of all these places where pieces of guidance might wait for them. But also give it to your IRB colleagues. Again, if you're in this situation where your local ethics board has not really informed itself on its own about the needs for preparing data for sharing from the very early stages of the process. And then in very, very concrete terms, if you're consulting with any one PI on a data management plan, ask them to see their consent script. And some of you might already do that, but I know it's not something that happens all the time, where people who help with the planning from the early stages bring the two pieces together, right? The informed consent script that lays out the commitments to human participants, and the data management plan that should lay out the data sharing plan post-project. So ask to see them at the same time and make sure that they're in alignment, make sure there's no discrepancies in what the PIs are planning to do or promising. And then in broad general training on DMP and DMP writing, make that point, highlight the DMP IRB nexus for PIs, because they might not realize it. Really, that's what we've been seeing, that if they're made aware of that need for alignment, it's pretty obvious, but sometimes they might not realize it on their own. And here at the very end of this slide and at the end of the presentation, I wanted to say that our attempt, and we'll continue building upon that, but our attempt to present some informed consent scripts or additions to scripts that specifically talk about data sharing can be found on this link. And we're always happy if, on the other hand, if you've seen some very good examples, and especially examples that cover specific scenarios that are not currently covered in our templates, feel free to contribute them if you want, if the PI that came up with them is interested in sharing them with other people who might be doing similar types of work. So data sharing does allow for nuance. It doesn't have to be that people promise that they will share everything in order to get the IRB approval. It is absolutely not the case. IRBs are more and more aware of that and are realizing that need for nuance and are quite receptive. That's really the biggest kind of promising takeaway. They are quite receptive, but just like everybody else, they can't, do all the lifting on their own. And in many cases, they're only now slowly starting to realize that they do have an important role to play. And so those of you and the data management community can reach out to them and offer them your assistance, so that collaboratively this presumed tension between ethical data sharing and human participant protection gets reduced and solved. So that's our presentation. And as I said, both Sebastian and I will be happy to take any questions that people might have.
Actually, I believe we are right at the end of our allotted time. So we might be able to get through one really quickly. Let's see. It says, can you share the 2017 publication citation, and is the 2019 work published in a manuscript?
The 2017 one actually was really mostly done for internal purposes, so there's no publication as such, but the pieces, there's presentations on it that I can share, absolutely. And the 2019 is being written up right now. So yes, okay. We can follow up with the person specifically when we have the publication.
Okay, thank you very much.